Laura Cunningham with the Western Watersheds Project, just an awesome scientist and artist who has been very active in protecting and preserving the natural world here. And also a visionary who's going to take us back 500 years in time so we can see just how beautiful this country was before all the settlers got here. So go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, thank you so much, Liz. And I apologize, there might be a slight time delay of 3 seconds between me talking and doing the slideshow. It's just my funky satellite internet out here in rural Death Valley National Park region. But yeah, thanks, Liz. And thank you for inviting me. Liz and I have been working on some local projects, and she is awesome. She's awesome advocate and activist. So this talk is about a book I published in 2010 on the historical ecology of California. It went into a 2nd edition, and now it's out of print. So I'm uploading the manuscript onto a free website, and it's taking forever because it's a large book. But when that website's up and live, I'll send you guys the link so you can see this stuff whenever for free. So, and this is great because I'm from Kensington and my sister works at Albany Hill as the native plant restoration biologist. So you're local for me. I married a park ranger and moved out of the Bay Area about 20 years ago. So that's why I'm down here in the desert now. But this presentation is about an hour, and we can have question and answer afterwards, and feel free to put questions in the chat, which I won't see until later, but yeah, we can have Q&A after that. So I'll jump in now and attempt to share my screen and get this going. So bear with me while I push all the buttons here. There we go. Okay, I think that's working. Oops. All right. Yeah, so growing up in the Bay Area, I mean, even as a kid, I always wondered what the city was like before the streets and the cars and the freeways. And I guess I was thinking a lot. I was an imaginative kid and self-taught artist. So you couldn't take pictures 500 years ago. So I had to learn how to do art to try to reconstruct scenes. And things that would go through my mind were down here, you can see on the left, I imagined a grizzly bear trail going through native bunch grasses and blue oaks. This is actually Marin County. And then this pastel is a coast live oak, which has a giant bear rub. Grizzlies inhabited the Bay Area commonly, and they like to get up against boulders and tree trunks and rub their backs. So you might have seen signs like this in the past. So growing up in the Oakland, Berkeley hills, I often went to Wildcat Canyon Regional Park, Tilden Park, some of my favorite areas. And there I learned about the processes of change and cycles, and not just the seasons of summer and winter, but going every weekend for 15, 20 years to the same creek, Wildcat Creek, you began to see things that you wouldn't normally see in just a couple of years. So a normal summer up here in the top left, the creek runs low. It's usually a perennial creek. But then during a severe drought, this was 1984, I did little oil sketches of the creek running dry. And I wonder what happened to the fish. And then down here on the lower left, a typical winter flow. And then if anyone has lived in the Bay Area for a while, the El Nino of 1981-82 is phenomenal. It was like a monster flood on Wildcat Creek. It took out the bridge, some bridges, flooded the parking lot at the Tilden Nature Center. So I began to understand that there were these cycles of change that sometimes took, part of a lifetime to see. So here, several years ago, I took a photo of Kensington looking west towards Mount Tam and Richmond Hills and all that. And I wondered, what did this area look like before the city? So here's an oil painting reconstructing using different old photos, maps. I'll show you how I do that later, but this is a scene of the Bay Area 500 years ago. There's the Golden Gate with no bridge. Here's San Francisco, and here's Albany Hill. You could have walked on the ridges, and purple needlegrass bunches would have been dense. And then if you walk down to the Bay Shore, you might have seen a scene like this, a beached gray whale and grizzlies. And I based this painting on an actual description in Monterey Bay in the 1860s where somebody actually saw the grizzlies eating their way into the whale and going inside of the whale and then coming back out. So this is kind of an actual scene that might have taken place. San Francisco today, this is on O'Farrell Street looking east, and you can just barely see the old Bay Bridge. This is an older photo. And I had to admit, this was difficult to try to picture in my head, what would this area look like, say 1,000 years ago? There's clues that you can see sometimes. Walking down the street, they were doing construction, and I noticed that there was sand under the pavement and even an old former brick road. So a lot of San Francisco was sand hills, and you can barely tell now. So here's the before from that photo, looking down Market Street, right down here. This bay has been filled in. There's skyscrapers on it now, and looking, there's Oakland, Berkeley Hills, Nob Hill right here. It was coastal prairie with Tule elk, California sagebrush. And here's a scene I was actually contracted to paint. They were doing construction on the Moscone Center and discovered an archaeological site of a village. I mean, this entire village. So they did a dig and asked me to reconstruct the village site. And again, they're just sand dunes all around here by Market Street. This is downtown San Francisco. I think this was about 1,000 years ago, the site. There's Mission Bay. Just a completely transformed landscape. Here's Oakland today, Lake Merritt. What was it like in the past? Oakland, of course, named after the coast live oak woodlands, and Lake Merritt was actually a saltwater inlet of the bay at the time. El Cerrito Plaza, this is where I grew up. There's Albany Hill covered with blue gum, eucalyptus planted. There's other clues that you can use, and this is a map hand drawn in 1830 during the Rancho period. They're called diseños, and since there was no fences for cattle back in the Mexican land grant era, they drew hand-drawn maps with all the different topographical features to delineate their rancho. And here, lo and behold, is Albany Hill and little esteros they drew here. There's the Coast Range, here's Richmond. So this is just an amazing snapshot back in time that's very useful. So here's my reconstruction of El Cerrito Plaza 1,000 years ago. Here's Albany Hill with grass and oaks and grizzlies. There are plenty of grizzlies. They were digging up the gophers here, and now they're eating fallen acorns. So what I tried to do in the book was go to different cities, and I didn't make it to all of them because it's a big state, but I would take pictures of, like, here's Santa Barbara, the Mission, and then try to reconstruct the exact scene with the exact mountains. And this was a little easier here because in the 1700s, the Spanish missionaries did leave some good descriptions of scattered oaks, some tall bunch grasses, good forage for their horses and mules, and Native Americans burning a lot. So you could get kind of a good picture of a couple of hundred years ago what the site was like. Here's the San Joaquin River today by Fresno, the Friant Dam. You can't even see the river. And in the past, a free flowing long river with salmon going high into the Sierra to spawn. Down in Southern California, here's San Fernando Valley today, just north of Hollywood. And I was able to go hike up and I look for these relict areas near the city and look for native plants, remnant habitats, you know, any birds or deer or other wildlife, and kind of gives me a on the ground feel for what might have been in the past. So field work is always really important for this. So in the past, San Fernando Valley was a vast grassland full of wildflowers in the spring and enormous grizzlies. Southern California had some of the largest grizzlies in North America, apparently. So as I said, field work is important. A lot of library internet research, old photos and paintings, historic maps. These are all the tools that I put together to form sort of a visual hypothesis of what a scene would look like in the past. And here's just my sister and I. This is actually, I think this is Albany or El Cerrito area. And we even, this is what I love about this, even in your backyard, you can find clues to the past, such as a creek that hasn't been covered. Or here, my sister and I found a native purple needlegrass bunch right on this kind of an empty lot area, just remnant from the past. So here's an illustration I did for Bay Nature years ago, and it was again a illustration of a Miwok village and along the Sacramento River in the North Delta. And so I did a pencil sketch and then sent it to the archaeologists for critique. And they told me, vary the architecture of the village site more. These are earth mounds, but they had apparently tule huts and different types of structures. So I changed that. Here's a colored pencil version of it. The vast delta and the riparian woodlands along the Sacramento River. So the book is organized into chapters that cover some of the more charismatic species. And of course, grizzly was the most interesting to just try to picture, you know, hiking in California when you had these like Yellowstone National Park grizzlies all over the place. This is the Mount Hamilton Range in the past with bunch grasses, blue oak savannas. So I indeed traveled to Yellowstone National Park several times in the 1990s to try to get a feel of what a landscape was like with grizzlies, because just going to a zoo, that wasn't going to cut it for me. So I found a group of like-minded bear watchers, and we parked our cars along the, like in Hayden Valley area, along the road, and we got our spotting scopes and binoculars out. And we just huddled together in a group right by our cars and then watched the grizzlies in the distance. It was great. We felt pretty safe. But there were mothers with cubs and large, huge males roaming around. So these are just field sketches I made as I was looking through a spotting scope. So here's an ink drawing of a California grizzly with purple needlegrass. So researching California grizzlies, they apparently ate just about everything. They were dined on blackberries, manzanita berries. They grazed on green clover. They used their claws, which were not actually very predatory type claws, but more digging. They're actually tools. They would dig up wild onion bulbs, look for grubs under logs and rocks. They dig up ground squirrels, but they were also large and fast and powerful enough to attack a full-grown elk, which is used to be anyway the size of a horse. I think they've gotten smaller since the gold rush. We'll discuss that soon, why elk are probably smaller. But in the past, they were horse-sized and grizzlies could just bowl them over. So they were probably a force in the ecosystems of California to help shape them. And of course, salmon, the abundant salmon provided just a wealth of nutrition for grizzlies up and down the state. This is the Sacramento River in the past. So here's a sketch of these long claws that grizzlies have that they use mostly for digging. And so they were extinct by 1924. And there are two places in California where the last grizzly might have been sighted. One was in the southern Sierra Nevada, low in the forests. I think it was Fresno County. And then another one was sighted in the wild Los Padre National Forest wilderness areas of Chaparral and rugged mountain ranges east of Santa Barbara. And then they were gone. So Tule elk and different elk subspecies in California. This was our main grazer. We did not have bison in California in the last 10,000 years, except perhaps in the northeastern corner. They just, for some reason, apparently there are possibilities that they made it through gaps in the Sierra at some point in, the last several thousand years, but they mostly were in the Great Plains and up in Eastern Oregon. So elk were the main grazers, and we had three subspecies: Tule elk, which was the Bay Area elk; Roosevelt elk, darker in the Pacific Northwest, the Redwood belt; and then Rocky Mountain elk east of the Sierra Nevada and Cascades. So here's a map showing where elk were in California, apparently from specimens, museum specimens. They weren't a desert animal. They were definitely a grassland, oak savanna type animal. So here's an oil painting of probably a typical scene. This is near Sunol, one of my favorite regional parks and the wilderness there. So Tule oak and a blue oak savanna. Sacramento today, what was it like in the past? Vast valley oak savanna with marshes and just huge herds of elk. I mean, people found herds of 1,000 elk just roaming the Sacramento Valley along with pronghorn antelope. So I have to, of course, focus in on Point Reyes National Seashore. As some of you might be aware, there's an ongoing environmental review by the National Park Service about whether to expand and continue cattle ranching on the seashore and perhaps cull some of these elk. This is a free roaming Drake's Bay herd, which is proposed to, actually they want to shoot some of these elk, just a few each year, because they trespass on the cattle pastures and steal the cows' grass. So that's an area where Liz and a whole group of really active people are working to try to convince the park that this is not a good idea in a national park unit. So these are some of the free roaming elk that you can see around Lemon Tour and Drake's Beach, and they have to live with these beef cows and dairy cows. They have to deal with fences. Sometimes they get tangled up in them. They can jump fences, but they might get a foot stuck in them. This is a map quickly. I mean, there's several resources where you can see all of this material too. I'm sure Liz can share that with you. A lot of good websites. The park has all this on its website, but these are all the ranches. These are, the tan are dairies and the cream are beef, or sorry, the other way around. The cream color are the dairies and the tan are the beef ranches. So That's about a third of the park, and including the northern district of Golden Gate National Recreation Area. So this is all, we're awaiting a decision whether the park will choose of several alternatives that they proposed. And I personally, and I know Liz did too, chose the conservation alternative, which would have retired the cows, closed these ranches, and opened them up for elk and other wildlife. However, we believe the Park Service is going to pick their preferred alternative of keeping the cows and extending their leases for 20 years more. So, and there's some devastating things happening in the Tamales Elk Reserve, which is this area right here, and which was not included in this environmental review. And there's a fence that keeps these elk trapped on this very dry, narrow spit of land. And so during this extreme drought, they've actually been dying in the hundreds. It's actually a travesty. And this poor elk got his antler stuck in some sort of like junk part of the fence and must have died of not a good death. So a lot of us are very angry that this fence even exists. So that's another controversy. But moving on, I have a chapter on pronghorn antelope, which were all over California, the deserts, the Bay Area. They were sighted on Point Reyes National Seashore in the past. The only place they didn't go was the forest in Sierra Nevada. Here's a pencil drawing of just the interesting color patterns of a male antelope. And antelope can run like at 60 miles per hour for a pretty sustained amount of time, and there's no predator that can keep up with them. So there's a theory that during the Ice Age, prior to 10,000 years ago, we had a North American cheetah. Cheetahs were actually native to North America as well as Africa and Eurasia. And of course, cheetahs can, you know, burst to almost 70 miles per hour at times. So they might have been a driver in the evolution of the speed of our pronghorn antelope today. So wolves also were a predator all across the state and were hunted out. And I'm sure you all know that they've now returned, which is such an interesting part of the story of the wolves. And my book, you know, books are great, but it's hard to update them. And so my 2010 book, I don't even predict that wolves would have reintroduced themselves to California. So the fun part of making this book into a website is I can update it and say, well, Harry, here's the latest wolf to come into California. So these are field sketches. Again, Yellowstone National Park was just an amazing place to go wolf watching as well as bear watching. Here's a wolf that I watched like at dawn come out of a forest, and it just found a meadow vole and started playing with it. So, I mean, they largely eat small animals, and they will also kill elk. This was an elk that the wolf pack killed, and it fed the grizzlies, the eagles, the ravens, the coyotes. So they eat quite a lot of different foods. So like here's a type of update that I'll put on the website. Wolf OR93 from Oregon came down from Oregon, and this is its current estimated location, which to me is just amazing. It has a radio collar, and this was in early April, and since April, the collar signal blinked out, and it's a mystery whether, you know, maybe it died, although the collar should give like a death signal if the wolf hasn't moved in, you know, 48 hours or so. So we're not sure what's going on, but it was headed towards Los Padres National Forest, which recall is one of the last places grizzlies were sighted. But the amazing thing about this map is this lone wolf traveled all the way to almost Fresno, crossed Highway 99, crossed the agricultural industrial center of the San Joaquin Valley, maybe at night, nobody saw it. Then it crossed the busy Interstate 5 and then crossed Highway 101. And nobody even knew. It's the radio caller gave the signals. So I think this is fascinating because some of us think that wolves could perhaps make it to Point Reyes National Seashore, and we were laughed at. You know, that's the way that you could create like a Yellowstone type ecosystem with a complete predator and prey, is to have wolves hunt the elk at Point Reyes. And here you can see they're going past Point Reyes. So another wolf just entered the state yesterday from Oregon. So it'll be interesting to see where that one goes. California also had jaguars prior to the 1850s. They were sighted along the Colorado River, which is this area, a lot of cottonwoods and willows. And they were also sighted along the coast coming up from Mexico in the dense oak woodlands all the way to San Francisco. So the coastal oak belt apparently had jaguars as well. And then they disappeared when civilization moved in. California condor is a big success story, which I've been watching since the mid 1980s. I did a lot of, again, going down and making field sketches of some of the last wild condors in that Los Padres National Forest area. That's like a center for some of our historic legacy of wildlife. And they were going downhill fast because they would eat lead bullets from deer that were hunted and then got away, wounded, but still had a bullet. And when the condors ate the deer carcass, they'd ingest lead and then die of lead poisoning. So the decision was made to capture all the condors out of the wild and then breed them in captivity in several different zoos. And at the time that was a little controversial, but it worked. They bred plenty of chicks and then reintroduced them back into their former range. And it's been very successful. And condors now are like in the Grand Canyon area. They're at Pinnacles National Park. I mean, they're getting close to the Bay Area, and they're soon to perhaps be introduced to the Redwood National Park area. So that will be exciting. This scene of the past could come alive again. So salmon. I have a chapter about salmon, which is, again, it's like the passenger pigeon. You read the historic descriptions, and it was like the most super abundant fish in California. And it's only been going downhill from the age of dams, water developments, water pollution, grazing, we'll see. And it's kind of more of a sad story because it seems to not be getting any better for salmon. This is the Chinook salmon, which was a big 4-foot long main stem river salmon. So they were in the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers, the Klamath River, the Eel River. So I have a painting of the Carquinez Strait in the past, and I imagine some Ohlone Miwok people watching this migration. There are many different strains of salmon, but at certain times, probably 1 million giant 4-foot Chinook salmon were crowding through this gap in the Coast Range on their way up to the Northern Sierra, the Southern Sierra. And it just must have been an amazing sight. I mean, there's exaggerated stories where people say you could walk across the backs of the salmon, to cross. But I'm sure it was probably almost like that at times. There's still a couple of undammed rivers and streams where you can see the Chinook spawning. This is a tributary of the Smith River up by the Oregon border, and you can see these dark fish are these big salmon nesting. My finger jumped here. An oil painting. So the other common salmon we used to have, and they're still around, but they're very rare. In fact, many of them are federally endangered and threatened. The coho salmon was our coastal salmon that was from Oregon to maybe Santa Cruz and the coastal streams, cold water coastal streams. And this is a male I found actually on the Columbia River, and they're just scarlet red during the spawning season. There's a couple places, maybe some of you have gone to Lagunitas Creek in Marin County, you can still see coho salmon spawning, although not in a drought year. I think that they wade in the ocean for better conditions. But I was lucky enough to see them probably in the 90s in a good year, and reconstructed a scene with a grizzly mother and cubs feeding on, when the salmon finish spawning, they die and fertilize the forests with their bodies. So one thing that's a big cause of salmon and trout and steelhead decline is erosion of soil, loss of soil in uplands. And the erosion causes silt to flow down and enter creeks. And the spawning gravels of salmon need to be clean, well oxygenated water. Here's some sketches of the female. She uses her tail to build like a nest. It's called a redd. And then she lays the eggs after the male fertilizes them in these spawning gravels. And then the tiny fish use these as cover until they grow. But on the bottom here, you can see a sketch. If the gravels become embedded with silt, they can't support salmon any longer. So the history of the whole West Coast, unfortunately, is just one after another, where we've been clear cutting watersheds and just trashing these salmon streams. And then you still see this, cattle grazing, their hooves just chiseling away at the deep, cool streams, and they're trampling and overgrazing. They just basically lower the water table, disconnect these streams from even their floodplain, and then remove all the vegetation. And all you have left is this hot, shallow, polluted water body, and salmon cannot be supported there. So surprisingly, this is happening at Point Reyes National Seashore today. And that's part of why many of us are active to try to get the cows out. Here's Home Ranch, a beef ranch that's leasing our public land. This is public land in Point Reyes National Seashore. And as I'll show in the grassland section, this is all kind of a pretty green lawn, but it's all introduced annual grasses from Europe and the Mediterranean region. And there's no coastal prairie left. And it's become so overgrazed that erosion is starting. This is a head cut. That's just, as you can see, the soil is being removed, and every rainstorm removes more soil, and it travels down and clogs the salmon streams. This is surprisingly Olema Creek, critical habitat for both coho salmon and steelhead trout. Just remember that illustration where the banks are collapsing and the vegetation removed. This is in Golden Gate National Recreation Area, right on the border of the seashore. And right here, you can see the bank collapsing and sediment just washing into this salmon stream. And the park says, well, we're trying to repair it. But when you go there and you see their attempts at mitigating this damage, it's not working. They have planted wheat grass to try to stabilize the soil. And then they put these straw wattles here, which are actually eroding away into the stream. And you can see how turbid the water is. It should be crystal clear. So this is, to me, a little outrageous that this is a national park unit. But moving on, in the book, I cover not only some of the more interesting species of California's past, but some habitats, plant communities. So oaks, this is actually, maybe some of you have visited the Berkeley mortar rock parks. I think there's a couple of them. This is one in Berkeley, and it's still there and surrounded by suburban houses now, but you can still see these mortars put into this bedrock and these boulders where Ohlone women would collect acorns and pound them into meal. So here's a Sacramento River jungle in summer with wild grapes, very dense, lush habitat. And in winter, in the past, before the age of dams and dikes and water diversions, the snow melt would have spread out over the banks of the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers and just formed these shallow lakes that would have gradually dried up. So, I mean, there was a lot of water in California, and we've kind of sucked it all up now and are having water wars. But in the past, this would have been a spring scene of just watering these valley oaks and these vast grassy valleys. And here's the San Joaquin Valley today. And this is actually in the 90s when they had more cotton. And I've noticed over the years, it's all turned to almond orchards, which use a tremendous amount of water. But anyway, that's the picture I took for the after. And the before scene in the eastern San Joaquin Valley were these beautiful giant valley oak savannas with swards of creeping wild ryegrass, a native rhizomatous grass that's just spread out in acres and acres. And the first Europeans to travel through here in the 1800s commented that this looked like an English park back in London. And it looked so manicured and managed. And what they didn't realize is it was by native tribes with fire. And we'll get to that soon. So the grasslands are my favorite part of early California, probably because I learned that my house in Kensington used to be a grassland. So early on, I tried to learn how to identify grasses and then find the relict native grasses around the state. So when I give this, before the pandemic, when I gave this presentation live to an audience, I'd say, raise your hand if you can figure out where this scene is today. This is a scene of the past. And these are nodding needle grasses on the hills. And since we can't do that in a Zoom, I'll just tell you, this is Silicon Valley. So there's Redwood City and Mountain View across the bay. There's Apple and all those. But in the past, it was a vast network of marshes in the South Bay and grassy hills, oak groves here and there. Very different from today. So I did a lot of study of our native grasses, which you can still find in this sea of European weedy grasses. And here's a little bit about book publishing, how difficult it is sometimes to get everything right in a book. The book was about 367 pages long. It took 4 years to edit my giant manuscript down, and they had to just cut out a lot. This is a scene of California oat grass, a native bunch grass at Mount Diablo State Park, but in the past. So this oat grass is interesting because it has horizontal stems, unlike a lot of other grasses which grow vertically. This one, the seed heads grow along the ground. And I always wondered, well, maybe because it's trying to hide those seed heads from grazing tule elk. So, oops, sometimes this jumps. So I drew this California oat grass and its habit and the words. And then after our editing process, the publisher sent me a PDF of the whole book by a designer, and they had everything laid out. And they said, Laura, can you go through all of this for any error? And so I did, but I missed a couple of things that are in the book. And one of them is that the designer turned my California oat grass from horizontal to vertical, including the wording. So I noticed this and I called up, I noticed it really late. I just missed it. And I called up the publisher and I said, well, could you fix this? And they said, sorry, it's off to the printer. So, but I'm probably the only person that cares about this minor error. So there's a lot of lost grassland habitats. Even in the Oakland flats and Berkeley flats, there were vernal pools in the 1800s that botanists found. I mean, they're just completely covered up now. Very rare habitat. So these are sketches I make. These are actually mostly in, well, here's Rush Creek in Marin County, another part of, this is Mount Tamalpais. But if I discover a nice stand of native grasses, I try to make little sketches of how the grasses are growing. And these, you get enough of these over the state and you can start to really picture what our native perennial bunch grasses were like. Here's just some more field sketches of the types of things I observe. This is actually San Geronimo Valley in Marin. You can still find these native grasses. Here's another oil painting again of Albany Hill, looking down from Kensington across the bay. And it was described by the first Europeans as a very grassy area. A lot of the ridge lines in the bay, they said, were covered with grasshoppers all summer. But in the spring, you might have had spectacular wildflower displays like this, such as you can sometimes see in a really wet year in Carrizo Plain. And then the native grazers, there are no fences. Tule elk, pronghorn grazed very lightly on the land and probably had huge migrations from the Coast Range to the Central Valley marshlands. And so a lot of the grasslands were not just constantly grazed with fenced livestock. And this might be hard to read on the screen, but it'll be up on my website. I mean, after studying the Point Reyes situation, I kind of tried to model in an illustration what happened to these grasslands. This shows what's going on in the soil. These were deep-rooted native grasses. Sometimes the roots would go down 6 feet, and this stores a lot of carbon. And they'd interact with something called biological soil crust, which is mosses, lichens, green algae, mushrooms, liverworts. I mean, this whole living network of like mycelial net, like in the soil. So this absorbed water, sequestered carbon, elk moved through, didn't stay that long. Then we put cows on and we fenced them in, and we grazed them there for all year or during the growing season. They're larger than elk and they trample, they graze. And so this actually, they choose to eat the native bunch grasses first because those are like ice cream plants. And then what moves in are the European weeds, annual grasses, thistles, which are kind of co-adapted to this level of heavy grazing in Europe. So this is kind of what results in a lot of California rangelands that aren't well managed, is a dead soil that doesn't sequester carbon. And so the whole notion of carbon farming is somewhat questionable to me. Now here's an example of this remarkable coastal prairie with this living soil that some friends and I found in an ungrazed part of Point Reyes National Seashore. This is a Pacific reed grass. And then we got down on our hands and knees and saw these lichens. Now this is the fog belt, so you wouldn't see this in Sacramento Valley, but this was like a miniature rainforest of tiny fungi and mosses. Here's a lichen that's a cup-shaped lichen and this carpet of green moss. And here's a view on my belly of this very good example of a pristine coastal prairie that hasn't been trampled. Here's another coastal prairie on an ungrazed section of Point Reyes with these Idaho fescue, red fescue, blue wild rye. Again, they're deep rooted. They just are like a sponge to walk on, and they absorb the rainwater. They're full of interesting wildflowers like buttercups. Here's this beautiful Mariposa lily. These are all destroyed by the cattle grazing. Here's a coast lotus, which is a rare plant. And then more of the fescue bunches, Mariposa lily. But on the other side of the fence, this is what you see in Point Reyes in some of the dairies is extreme overstocking of cows, erosion, gullying. This is all introduced annual grass grazed down to the shallow roots. And I did some comparisons of Tule elk versus cows, and the Tule elk at Point Reyes they weigh only like 400 to 500 pounds. They're not that big anymore. And the dairy cows can weigh like 1,500 pounds. I mean, giant. So a big difference there. Here's a track of a Tule elk that I actually found in that coastal prairie. And then here's your typical cow track, quite a large footprint compared to the native Tule elk. Here's Tule elk droppings and compared to cow manure. Again, it's quite different. And if you were to go and try to yank up this fescue bunch right here in the coastal prairie, you could not dig it up. Again, roots go down feet into the ground compared to these very shallow annual grasses from Europe and the grazed pastures that die every year. These fescue bunches can live to be 100 years. And the grazing, unfortunately, brings a lot of weeds into the prairies, the native grasslands. The cow, this is milk thistle, poison hemlock, hair barley, and they even plant mustard and radish as a type of moist hay called silage on Point Reyes National Seashore to feed all the hungry dairy cows. So by the end of the summer, and this wasn't a drought year, this is the end of September, it's hammered. I mean, there's almost no plant life left in some of these overstocked fenced pastures. I mean, there's just completely no bunch grasses left here. And then on top of that, the dairies have to deal with excess cattle manure, and they will sometimes liquefy it and then spread it on their pastures. So this is your national park with manure spread all over. And then this, of course, can wash into adjacent waterways and lead to pollution spikes, fecal coliform and other bacteria. I mean, I could go on and on about Point Reyes, but I know I'm trying to keep this under an hour. So in addition to the grizzlies and the elk and the condors and the interesting native grasslands and other habitats, at the end of my research, I realized that the most interesting part of California's legacy was the processes that shaped the landscape: fire, flood, climate. And I can't go into too much detail because I'm trying to keep this under an hour, but fire, just such an important process that has become even more important in the last 10 years. I mean, it's a problem, but in the past, native tribes used fire as a major tool for managing the landscape in many, many ways. I mean, they did annual burns on the grasslands. They had a rotation of fire in oak woodlands that didn't kill the oaks, but renewed them. There might have been the occasional lightning strikes in the mountains, but one lightning strike every 50 years was enough to renew that landscape, that vegetation. So there might have been a model of tribal cultural fire management on the flatter areas and hills, occasional lightning ignitions, and this kept the fuel load quite low for thousands of years. And I've interviewed Ohlone and other tribal elders, and they told me we burned everything, and even the salt marshes around the San Francisco Bay. And all these plants are actually fire adapted. Low intensity grass fire was a very common tool, maybe every 5 to 10 year rotation in different areas. It was very well planned. So learning all this, I had to go investigate before, during, and after, such a prescribed fire that I could find. This is actually a blue oak savanna in the North Coast Range. This was a prescribed burn, just very slow, cool flames that travel in a controlled way. And then they singe the oaks. And I went back 2 weeks later and thought, uh-oh, the oaks look dead, but they're actually not. They start to sprout leaves. And then in this painting at the bottom, you can see these little green tufts were actually some of the perennial purple needlegrass were actually resprouting leaves right 2 weeks after this fire in fall. So here's some field sketches I made of an interior live oak sprouting after a fire. A blue oak sprouts new leaves after this fire. And so they're not dead at all. The oaks, if it's a cool surface fire on the ground, they'll just singe, maybe burn a little bit of the crown, but oaks are quite fire adapted, I discovered. And elk love to go to resprouting bunch grasses that have been burned lightly, because the bunch grass, it has all of its reserves and deep roots. And so the top parts are removed by the flames and then it resprouts very quickly. And this is like candy to elk. And the tribal cultural managers knew this. So these are just some field sketches of flames going through a chaparral area. And again, many chaparral plants, such as chamise, have a deep tuber that they, again, will resprout. This is the sprouts of a chamise plant after a fire. The Sierra Nevada had a different fire regimes as well. It had a lot of cool surface fires in the lower, more open Ponderosa belt. And then it would have high intensity fires in other parts. I mean, it was a very complex system. So that would remove, a lot of the trees, but again, it was a patch work and it would regrow and we didn't have logging. And so there are different fire regimes in the Sierra, but we've, meddled with that quite a lot. So one of the more eye-opening things I got to do, and we're kind of wrapping up here briefly, but I got to participate right before the pandemic in a tribal cultural burn, the Klamath Training Exchange up in Northwestern California, invited as an observer and nature journaler. We called ourselves the fire journalers by the Chinook and Yurok tribes, who hosted all of us to teach us about cultural fire and how they've been managing their watersheds for thousands of years. They are experts in fire. And so they invited, this is Nature Conservancy, these two people, and this is one of the local fire crew bosses who studies with the Chinook and Yurok, and the Forest Service came, the Bureau of Land Management, international firefighters from Spain came to learn from the tribes how to reintroduce good fire back into the landscape. So they had us, put on the gear and the helmets, and we went through the fire training and went out there with the crew and rode in the fire trucks. And it was interesting. I learned a lot about fire in that they had a hard time getting it going. I mean, we're so used to like wildfires, but this was just at the beginning of the rainy season, and the fuel leaf litter was too moist. And this is one of the fire guys doing a moisture content measurement of the ground leaf litter here. And for a week before we arrived, it was too moist and they couldn't get the fire going. So fortunately, we came for 3 days and they were able to, the fuel got dry enough where they could start the prescribed fire. And again, it was just, they had a fire line, but it was just tiny little flames licking at the leaf litter. And the tribes did not use chainsaws. They said, we don't need that. And this is a 20-year plan to keep every 8 years will burn this Doug fir tan bark oak forest, and each time it'll thin some of the forest. They had a really long-term vision for this area. So a lot of their cultural fire was to renew important plants, food plants like berry bushes, hazelnuts, and basketry plants. So this is a Doug fir oak woodland forest that was burned just in the ground the previous year. And you can see it's pretty green and it's resprouting. And this is this Yurok lady, Margot Robbins, who showed us these are the hazelnut stems that sprout after a fire. And they grow very straight and tall only after a fire. And they make all sorts of things, baskets, cradles. This is a traditional hat that the women wore. So she said they haven't even been able to collect basketry materials since 1911 is when the Forest Service, the federal government, came in and told the tribes, you cannot burn, fire's bad. So they've been dealing with Smokey the Bear for decades. And only I think in the last decade are agencies and the rest of us starting to listen to the tribes. And they invited us specifically to learn from them and say, please spread this around, that fire is not a bad thing if you know what you're doing. So here's again the fire line, and they're taking these little drip torches and just dropping little tiny flames to get rid of some of this excess fuel. It gets rid of oak weevils that can infest their acorn groves. And so again, this is probably too busy for this Zoom, but I developed a model of today. We have really thick, overgrown thickets of forest, and then there's clear cuts that grow back, and it actually has lowered the water table because there's so much thickety forest that it actually transpires a lot of water, and there's springs that have dried up. The Klamath River doesn't support as much salmon. So in the past, and this is what their goal is to try to get back to, is a more open forest with ponderosa, sugar pine, some open prairies. Springs might start popping up again. So, but a lot more grassy, and then the hazelnut and huckleberry thickets will come back. So this is their long-term goal, is to get back to this pre-1911 state. So, but today, of course, we have this, problem with fire where we sort of ignore the past thousands of years of cultural management and fire management and let things get out of hand. I was actually driving over Lida Summit, east of the White Mountains, and it was a clear blue day, and I saw this, it looked like an atomic bomb blast. So I didn't have a camera, and I got out of the car to sketch it. And it was actually the creek fire. And it was the first time I'd seen a pyrocumulus cloud, a cloud causing its own weather from this conflagration that had just started a day before. I mean, I talked to a firefighter who was trying to get in there, and he said there were lightning bolts coming out of it. So this is obviously what we're doing is not working to manage California. And I mean, we really do have to learn from the tribes again, how to get back to cultural fire management. And this is a painting of a woman in the Tehachapi Mountains, and she has burned this gray pine interior live oak area the year before, and she's collecting again these straight sticks, these shrubs that grow straight for basketry materials. So this would have been a typical scene across a lot of California in the past. So flood, I'm going to skip through all of these because I know we don't have enough time, but here's about the end. And this is my sister who lives in Richmond Annex, and she planted a little coastal prairie grassland, native grassland, in her tiny little yard. Here's some, oops, oh, okay. It wanted to stop, okay. tried to get back. I have 2 more slides. So back, I don't have a way to get back to the end, but I just want to finish this story. So anyway, my sister she went and collected seed from the local, oh dear, well, I'll just tell the story. She went and collected seed from the local area and grew these wildflowers and native grasses in her yard and did a really nice job of just this little tiny recreation. And then one day she got this knock on the door, and it was the city of Richmond telling her that the neighbors were complaining about the weeds in her yard and she had to remove it. And so she didn't take that lightly and said, no, I'm not going to remove these native plants. But she went door to door to all of her neighbors on the street and enlisted them in native plant gardening. And now she has this whole, I mean, most of them, some of them are educated, but not into it. But most of them now they have little nurseries, they trade native seeds, and they have all these different native gardens on this street. So, and then the city of Richmond left her alone. So I like to end with that story because it just shows that we can, even in our tiny urban backyards, we can get a little bit of that California legacy back and restore even a tiny amount of, she has butterflies and things like that. So that's the end of the presentation, and I'd be happy to answer questions.
That was fabulous. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, most of y'all are muted. If you have a question, you can unmute yourself. And I guess just go ahead and ask. Also, I think somewhere there is a place you can raise your hand down at the bottom. Maybe it's under reactions. Anyway, I'll look in the chat. Any questions? Joanne, unmute yourself, please.
Okay, I thought I did, sorry. How did your sister go about finding the native plants that belonged in her area of the Bay Area? Like, I live in Oakland and keep wondering, where would I go to find out what grasses used to be here before cattle were raised in Oakland?
Yeah, that's a good question. She's kind of like me and sort of an amateur botanist, and she's learned the native grasses. So there's places, even in Richmond, like the Richmond Field Station, that has beautiful stands of native grasses. I mean, you're not really, I guess, technically allowed to pick seeds even in a regional park, but I mean, there's Point Pinole has amazing stands of native grasses, but she knows all the little empty lots even before they get dug up, and she goes and collects some of the seed from native plants. So I guess you have to, get in with a group of people that can identify these things, but they're becoming less and less each year, but there still are places like Albany Hill. It had native grasses before she started restoring it. So she would carefully collect seeds of like foothill needlegrass, blue wild rye, and then have a nursery grow them out. And then she'd come back and plant them.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, you should go volunteer with my sister at Albany Hill Park, and she will teach you.
There's a question in the chat from Stephen Brown, who asks, would grizzlies gather by salmon rivers or whales in large groups? How much territory do they usually need for hunting and raising families?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think you see grizzlies, if there's a spot of high food concentration, the grizzlies will group together and feed on salmon runs, beached whales, acorns that are coming down. So, or even like a particularly delicious root that they like to dig up. So yeah, they will concentrate in groups, and you see that in the Rocky Mountains still. And as for their range, I think they were very good wanderers and ranged probably over hundreds of miles. But of course, we can't study the California grizzlies, and they were probably very diverse ecotypes of grizzlies that are gone.
Yeah, if those of you are watching the chat, there's just a ton of good suggestions here about where to find California native plants. The Native Plant Society, Tilden Park, several nurseries around here. So if you're interested in getting your hands on some native plants, go ahead and look in the chat. And at the bottom, there's like 3 little dots where it says file, 3 little dots. You can hit the little dots and save everything that's in the chat. And then you'll have all these resources here for more native plants. Liz Horowitz
Here's
has
a question I see in the chat.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
No, you go.
Deer. We have a lot of deer in our gardens in El Cerrito. Were they here in the past? Yes, we had mule deer, different kinds of subspecies of deer, and I just didn't include them because it's, you know, it was a long book and I couldn't cover everything, but there might have been slightly less deer because they had competition with elk. There were native wolves, jaguars were probably hunting them. So, but yeah, we had deer.
Are there other questions? And folks, you can unmute yourself and just sing out. I can't see all of you. There's too many.
I just typed in a question, but I can say it.
Sure.
Thank you, Laura, for your presentation. It was just amazing. And I am currently working in the lower Russian River in Sonoma County and trying to save the Coho salmon. And I was wondering if you've done any research in the lower part, like around Green Valley Creek, Dutchville Creek, Willow Creek, you know, into the estuary.
Yeah, you know, again, the book was 300 pages, so I actually have a painting of the mouth of the Russian River where, you know, there used to be a sandbar, and I think still is sometimes, and talk about that. And I didn't include that tonight, but so I have in the past, but not recently, and not specifically those creeks. But the website, the book again is out of print. So if you find a used copy, I think you're, you know, dig them up somewhere. But I'll have a whole section on the new website about Coho salmon, and might be able to talk a little bit about the Russian River too. So yeah.
Great.
I'm glad you're doing work there. That's always important.
Yeah, well, we're doing some restoration work. And right now I'm focusing on Green Valley Creek. And I actually met a historical ecologist that he knows, like, because I would like to do find out what the area was like before the pioneers came in and when the Southern Pomo and the coastal Miwok were living there. And he's trying to find out some more. Did you find out anything about the Native Americans in the area when you were doing your research?
You know, I'll type my email into the chat and you should email me, okay. You know, because we could talk a while and I don't want to hold up the group, but I mean, there's some things I learned about the North Coast Range in general that could apply to that area. I mean, I don't think I've specifically studied the little creeks you're restoring, so I don't have that, but I have some more general information that I could definitely share with you. So I'll type my email in and feel free to email me.
And one more question. Is the name of your book A State of Change? Yeah.
Yes.
But there are some copies in Amazon.
Yeah, I don't get any royalties from Amazon, and they overcharge. And yeah. But yeah, if you want to support Amazon.
Not
But
really.
I mean, all the manuscript will be free online on a new website I am making for the end of the year. It's still taking me a long time to upload everything, so
Okay.
it will be available for free. Yeah, in the future.
Great. That would be great. Thank you again.
How do we find when the website is up? I can definitely tell Liz and she can tell you all.
Yeah, I'll tell the Sierra Club, actually. They're the ones that do all the outreach. I just find the speakers.
Well, we'll let Julie blast it out for us.
She will. She's good at it. Stephen Brown, you have your hand up. Unmute yourself. There you go.
Okay, hi. I've become aware of some very, I have limited awareness of the current native communities from the Ohlone and Miwok and Chochenyo and others in the Oakland area. And let's see, what am I wondering? Could you point to resources, groups that are active in looking at the historical perspective and getting into the culture, the native plants, the handcrafts, those kinds of things?
You know, actually, I can give you a really good example. Yeah, and I think someone in the chat's answering you too, but you could Google shell mounds. There are a lot of groups trying to protect shell mounds in the East Bay, such as the Emeryville shell mound, which there's an ongoing controversy about developing this shell mound, which has burials and is hundreds, maybe thousands of years old. So I can't recall the names of the groups, but if you Google shell mound, Ohlone, Emeryville, there are some websites of groups, including my old publisher, Malcolm Margolin, is helping them to try to protect these like amazing archaeological cultural resources. And they probably have a lot of other information on there about, the culture they're trying to reconstruct and save.
Yeah, and in the chat, somebody has also given us a link to the Sagarte Land Trust that I mentioned earlier, that indigenous people are basically taking back their land so that they can live on it, preserve their culture. There's also a link there to called the Shumi land tax if you want to donate voluntarily money to help them continue to acquire and restore their land and their culture there. It's a really good website. Any other questions? I can't see everybody. So you're just going to have to unmute yourself and speak up or put it in the chat. Okay, I'm not seeing any more hands. So with that, I think we can wrap up. Laura, thank you so much. This was so interesting.
Well, thank you for the invitation, Liz.
Oh, it's been delightful. And again, everybody just take advantage of all those links in the chat about where you can find native plants and plant them in our yards and take back the land. All right.
Hey, Laura, I didn't see your email address. Did you type it in the chat?
I did. It's L Cunningham at westernwatersheds.org.
Okay, thanks.
Feel free to email me with questions and yeah, I'll be happy to chat more.